There are moments in history when the ordinary becomes extraordinary, not through grand battles or political speeches, but through the quiet rhythm of daily life. Imagine waking in a world where your neighbor's greeting carries weight, where the bread you buy, the song your child sings, the book you hide beneath your pillow, all become acts of silent defiance or reluctant surrender. This is not a story of distant monuments or fading photographs. This is the story of mornings and evenings, of kitchens and classrooms, of whispers behind closed doors. Tonight, we step gently into the lives of those who lived through one of history's darkest chapters, not as soldiers or leaders, but as mothers, teachers, shopkeepers, and children. Let the shadows soften. Let the past speak quietly, and let us listen together as the night deepens around us. If these words carry you closer to sleep, let this channel stay by your side too. A gentle subscribe, a soft tap of the bell, small gestures that keep these stories alive night after night. Rest now. We'll walk this path together. Chapter 1. The Morning Rituals, Waking in a Controlled World. The alarm clock was not a gentle thing. It rattled on nightstands in Berlin apartments, in Munich flats, in farmhouses scattered across the Bavarian countryside. Its sound was metallic, insistent, a sharp pull from the world of dreams into the world of duty. And duty, in Nazi Germany, began the moment eyes opened. Morning light filtered through curtains, thin and pale, casting soft shadows across rooms that held both the familiar and the forbiddens. A family photograph on the mantel, a child's drawing tucked into a frame, a book hidden beneath a floorboard, its pages filled with words the state had deemed dangerous. These were the small rebellions of private space, the last corners of a life not yet fully surrendered. But the public world was waiting, and it demanded entrance. In the kitchen, a mother moved quietly, her hands practiced in the art of making something from almost nothing. Butter was rationed, measured in grams, each portion carefully logged in ration books that bore the eagle and swastika. Real coffee was a memory now, replaced by ersatz blends, roasted grains, chicory, acorns ground into a dark powder that smelled of earth and compromise. She boiled water, poured it over the grounds, and watched as the liquid turned brown, a poor imitation of the morning she once knew. Bread sat on the table, dense and dark, made from flour stretched with sawdust and potato starch. It was not the bread of her childhood, soft and fragrant from the baker's oven. But it was bread. And in a world where hunger was always close, bread was survival. Her husband sat reading the Volkischer Beobachter, the official party newspaper. Its headlines screamed in bold type: victories on distant fronts, enemies exposed, the Führer's latest proclamation. He read without expression, his face a careful mask. Did he believe what he read? Did he question it in the silence of his own mind? These were thoughts never spoken aloud, not even between husband and wife. Trust was a luxury, and even love carried risk. The radio hummed to life, filling the kitchen with the voice of the state. Morning broadcasts were mandatory listening, or at least that was the unspoken rule. The voice was warm, confident, paternal. It spoke of community, of sacrifice, of the glorious future being built by loyal hands. And it warned, always gently, always with a smile in its tone, that enemies lurked among them, saboteurs, defeatists, those who spread doubt and poison. The children appeared, one by one, rubbing sleep from their eyes. The boy, 10 years old, wore his Hitler Youth uniform even though meetings were not until afternoon. He wore it with pride, his shoulders back, his chin lifted. He had been taught that the uniform was an honor, a symbol of belonging to the Volk, the people. His sister, 8, wore a crisp white blouse and dark skirt, her hair braided tightly, ready for school. She hummed a tune under her breath, a melody taught in her League of German Girls meetings, sweet and haunting. Their mother placed bowls before them, filled with thin porridge, sweetened with a spoonful of jam. The children ate quickly, efficiently, accustomed to scarcity. There was no complaining. Complaining was weakness, and weakness was not tolerated, not even in children. The father folded his newspaper and stood. He worked in a munitions factory on the city's edge, a place where the air tasted of metal and oil, where the noise never stopped, where every bolt tightened and every shell casing inspected was a contribution to the war effort. He kissed his wife on the cheek, a brief, formal gesture. He patted his son's head, and then he was gone, the door closing softly behind him, his footsteps fading down the stairwell. The mother turned to her children. "Finish your breakfast," she said quietly. "We leave in 10 minutes." The streets were alive with morning. Bicycles rattled over cobblestones. Trams clanged their bells, packed with workers heading to factories, offices, shops. The air smelled of coal smoke and damp stone, the scent of a city waking under occupation, not by foreign soldiers, but by its own ideology. Neighbors passed one another with nods, with raised arms, with the words that had become reflex, "Heil Hitler." The greeting was everywhere, unavoidable, a verbal checkpoint at every corner. To not say it was to mark oneself as suspicious, as other, as dangerous. And so people said it. Some with fervor, some with indifference, some with a hollowness that echoed in their chests long after the words left their lips. The mother walked her children to school, their small hands in hers. They passed a building that had once been a synagogue. Its windows were shattered, its doors boarded shut. No one looked at it directly. No one spoke of it. It had become a ghost in daylight, a thing erased not by removal, but by collective silence. At the school gates, other children gathered, their voices high and bright. Teachers stood watching, their eyes sharp, their smiles fixed. Education was no longer about curiosity or discovery. It was about shaping minds, about molding citizens who would never question, never waver, never doubt. The boy ran ahead to join his classmates, his hand shooting up in salute as he greeted his teacher. The girl hesitated, clinging a moment longer to her mother's hand. She looked up, her eyes wide and searching, and for a brief second, the mother saw something there. Confusion, perhaps. A question not yet formed into words. "Go on," the mother whispered, her voice soft. "It's all right." But was it? The question lived in her chest, unspoken, unanswered. She watched her daughter disappear into the building, swallowed by the system, and felt the familiar ache of powerlessness. She turned and walked back through the streets, past the propaganda posters plastered on every wall. Images of strong-jawed soldiers, of smiling families gathered around the hearth, of the Führer gazing into a noble distance. The posters promised strength, unity, destiny. They promised a 1,000-year Reich, a future so bright it blinded. But in the quiet spaces between the posters, in the alleyways and shadowed doorways, other realities lived. A woman hurried past, her yellow star sewn onto her coat, her head down, her steps quick. A man leaned against a wall, his eyes hollow, a veteran perhaps, or someone who had lost too much. A child sat on a stoop, watching the world with a solemnity no child should carry. The morning was a performance, and everyone had their role. The challenge was remembering which part was real and which was survival. Back in her apartment, the mother closed the door and leaned against it, breathing in the silence. The radio still murmured in the kitchen, the voice now discussing agricultural production, the importance of every citizen doing their part. She walked over and turned it off. The silence that followed was a small rebellion, a stolen moment, a breath of her own. She moved to the window and looked out at the city, at the rooftops and chimneys, at the flags hanging limp in the still morning air. Somewhere out there, people were being arrested. Somewhere, resistance was happening in whispers. Somewhere, choices were being made that would ripple through history. And here, in this small apartment, she stood with her ration book and her ersatz coffee and her carefully guarded thoughts, wondering what kind of world her children would inherit. Wondering if the morning rituals they performed so obediently would one day be remembered with shame or understanding. The day had only just begun, and already it felt unbearably long. The hours between morning and noon stretched like pulled thread, thin and tense. In classrooms across the Reich, children sat at wooden desks, their backs straight, their hands folded. The air smelled of chalk dust and old wood, of young bodies pressed close together, of something else too, something harder to name. Obedience, perhaps. Or fear dressed as enthusiasm. The teacher stood at the front, a map of Europe pinned behind her. She was young, perhaps 25, her hair pulled into a tight bun, her dress plain and modest. She had been trained in the new pedagogy, the one that replaced critical thinking with memorization, that turned history into mythology and science into propaganda. She believed in her work, or at least, she had convinced herself she did. Belief was easier than doubt, safer. Today, she said, her voice clear and bright, we will learn about the Volk. Who can tell me what the Volk means? Hands shot up, eager, competing. The boy from earlier, the one in the Hitler Youth uniform, was called upon. He stood, chest puffed, reciting the answer he had learned by heart. The Volk is the German people, bound by blood and soil, destined to lead the world into a new age of greatness. Very good, Hans, the teacher said, smiling. The Volk is our family, larger than any one household, stronger than any individual. And what threatens the Volk? Another child answered without waiting to be called. Enemies, Jews, communists, those who weaken us from within. The teacher nodded, satisfied. She turned to write on the blackboard, her chalk scratching out words in sharp, angular script: purity, strength, loyalty, sacrifice. In the back row, a girl named Greta stared at the words but did not see them. Her mind was elsewhere, lingering on the morning's walk to school, on the woman with the yellow star, on the way her mother's hand had trembled just slightly before letting go. Greta did not understand everything she felt, but she understood enough to know that something was wrong. Not wrong in the way a broken toy is wrong, but wrong in a deeper place, a place that made her stomach tighten and her throat close. She wanted to ask a question. She wanted to raise her hand and say, "But why? Why are they our enemies? What did they do?" But the words stayed locked inside her, held back by instinct, by the same survival mechanism that made animals freeze when predators passed near. The lesson continued. The children copied notes. They recited pledges. They sang songs about the fatherland, their voices rising in unison, filling the room with sound that was both beautiful and chilling. At recess, The children spilled into the courtyard, their energy unleashed. Boys played war games, dividing into sides, shouting orders, pretending to storm enemy lines. Girls jumped rope, their chants rhythmic and precise. Everything, even play, had structure, even joy had rules. Hans gathered his friends, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "My father says the war will be over soon. He says we're winning everywhere. He says soon we'll have more land, more food, more of everything." Another boy nodded eagerly. "My brother is in the Wehrmacht. He sent a letter. He said the soldiers are brave and strong, and the Führer is a genius." They spoke with certainty, with the confidence of those who have never been given reason to doubt. They had been raised on promises of greatness, fed a diet of victory and destiny. The world, as they understood it, was simple: us and them, right and wrong, strength and weakness. Greta stood apart, watching them. She thought of her uncle, her mother's brother, who had left suddenly one night 3 years ago. No one spoke of him anymore. It was as if he had never existed, but Greta remembered. She remembered his laugh, the way he told stories, the way he had called her Little Sparrow. She remembered her mother crying in the kitchen, her father's hand on her shoulder, his voice low and urgent. "We cannot speak of this. Not to anyone. Do you understand?" Not to anyone. She understood. Even at 8 years old, she understood that silence was survival. Across the city, in a different kind of mourning, a shopkeeper named Herr Lieberman unlocked the door to his small grocery. The bell above the door chimed softly, a sound he had loved once, back when customers entered freely, when business was not dictated by fear and regulation. His shop was modest, its shelves less full than they used to be. Rationing had changed everything. He no longer decided what to stock or how much to charge. The state decided. The state controlled the flow of flour, sugar, meat, butter. The state held the ledger of who deserved what and when. He swept the floor, a meditative task, his broom moving in slow, steady strokes. The morning light slanted through the window, catching dust motes in its beam. For a moment, he allowed himself to remember other mornings, mornings when his wife had stood beside him, arranging apples into pyramids, laughing at some small joke he had made. She was gone now. Not dead, but gone in a way that felt like death. Taken in the night, loaded onto a train with others whose only crime was existing. He had been spared so far because he was useful, because the neighborhood needed a grocer and the authorities had decided, for now, to let him remain. But the yellow star on his coat was a countdown, a ticking clock. He felt it every time a customer entered, every time someone looked at him with pity or disgust or carefully neutral indifference. The bell chimed again. A woman entered, her face drawn, her eyes tired. She was a regular, someone who had shopped here for years. She glanced at him, then quickly away, approaching the counter without greeting. "Half a kilo of flour," she said quietly. "And sugar, if you have any." He weighed the flour, his hand steady despite the tremor in his chest. He wrapped it in brown paper, tied it with string. "No sugar today, I'm afraid. Perhaps next week." She nodded, avoiding his gaze. She placed her ration coupons on the counter, along with a few coins. As she turned to leave, she hesitated, just for a heartbeat. Her lips parted as if to speak, but then she thought better of it. The door closed behind her, the bell chiming her exit. Herr Lieberman stood alone in his shop, surrounded by half-empty shelves and the ghosts of better days. He thought of his wife's face, the way she had looked at him that last night, her eyes full of a terrible knowing. He thought of his neighbors, the ones who no longer met his gaze, who hurried past his shop as if it carried disease. He thought of the mornings ahead, each one a negotiation with fate, each one a test of how long he could remain invisible enough to survive. The morning routine continued around him. The city woke, the factories hummed, the schools filled with children learning to hate. And somewhere, in offices with polished floors and cold efficiency, lists were being made, names checked off, fates sealed with bureaucratic precision. This was the morning in Nazi Germany. Not a single moment, but 1,000 small moments, each one a choice, each one a compromise, each one a thread in the larger tapestry of a nation that had traded its soul for promises of glory. And as the clock hands moved forward, as the sun climbed higher, the morning rituals gave way to the day's demands. The performance continued. The masks stayed on. And life, such as it was, carried on in the shadow of the swastika. The first chapter of the day was closing. But the story was far from over. Chapter 2. The Workday, Labor, Loyalty, and Silent Resistance. The factory gates opened at 6 in the morning, swallowing workers in waves. They came on foot, on bicycles, packed into trams that squealed along iron rails. They came with lunch pails clutched in calloused hands, with newspapers tucked under arms, with faces that had learned to reveal nothing. The factory was a world unto itself, a cathedral of industry where steel met fire, where human effort was transformed into the machinery of war. Inside, the noise was immediate and total. The clang of metal on metal, the hiss of steam, the rhythmic pounding of presses that never stopped, never rested. The air was thick with the smell of oil and sweat, with particles of iron dust that settled in lungs and clung to skin. Men moved along assembly lines, their movements precise and repetitive, each action rehearsed 10,000 times until thought was no longer necessary. Hands knew what to do. Bodies became extensions of the machine. Friedrich worked at Station 7, attaching firing mechanisms to artillery shells. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, tightening bolts, checking alignments, passing each completed piece down the line. He had been doing this for 3 years now, ever since his exemption from military service had been granted due to a childhood injury that left his left leg slightly shorter than his right. He walked with a limp, barely noticeable, but enough to keep him here, in this fluorescent-lit belly of production, rather than on some distant battlefield. He did not know where the shells went. He did not ask. But sometimes late at night when sleep refused to come, he wondered whose hands would load them, whose eyes would aim them, whose lives would end because of the work his own hands performed each day. These thoughts were dangerous. They served no purpose except to breed doubt, and doubt was a luxury no one could afford. Around him, other workers bent to their tasks. Some were young men like himself, classified as essential labor. Others were older, veterans of the First War, men who had already given limbs and years to the fatherland. And then there were the others, the ones who did not speak German as their first language, who wore different markings on their clothes, whose presence was explained away with clinical terms: foreign laborers, displaced workers, resources allocated for maximum productivity. They were prisoners, though that word was never used. They were Poles, Russians, French civilians taken from occupied territories and brought here to fill the gaps left by German men sent to fight. They worked longer hours for less food. They slept in barracks behind barbed wire. They were ghosts moving through the factory, visible but unseen, their suffering absorbed into the machinery as just another resource to be extracted. Friedrich tried not to look at them. Looking meant seeing, seeing meant knowing. And knowing meant carrying a weight that could crush a man from the inside out. The foreman walked the floor, clipboard in hand, eyes sharp and evaluating. He was a party member, his lapel pin polished and proud, his authority absolute. He stopped at Friedrich's station, watching the work with a critical gaze. "Production is down 3% this week," he said, his voice flat. "That is unacceptable. The Führer has asked for sacrifice. Every shell that leaves this factory is a blow against our enemies. Every moment of laziness is a betrayal." Friedrich nodded, his jaw tight. "Yes, sir. We'll increase output." The foreman moved on, his boots clicking against the concrete floor. Friedrich exhaled slowly, his shoulders releasing tension he hadn't realized he was holding. 3%. What did that even mean? 3% of what? Of an arbitrary quota set by men in distant offices who had never stood on this floor, never felt the ache in their backs after 12 hours of repetitive motion, never wondered if the work they did was building something or destroying it. In a different part of the city, in an office with tall windows overlooking a courtyard, Marguerite sat at her typewriter, her fingers flying over the keys with mechanical precision. She was a secretary in the regional administrative office, one of dozens of women who kept the bureaucracy running, who transformed spoken orders into written documentation, who filed reports and stamped forms and ensured that the wheels of governance never stopped turning. Her desk was neat, organized, everything in its place. A stack of correspondence on the left, carbon paper in the center, completed documents on the right. She typed without looking at her hands, her eyes scanning the handwritten notes from her supervisor, translating his scrawl into clean, official text. Today's work was routine. Requisition orders for medical supplies, personnel transfers, a memo regarding updated ration allocations, and then a different kind of document. A list of names, addresses, identification numbers. No explanation provided. No context given. Just names, and beside each one, a single word, relocated. Marguerite's fingers hesitated over the keys. She knew what that word meant. Everyone knew, even if they never spoke of it. Relocated did not mean moved to a new apartment or transferred to a new job. It meant something else, something that happened in the night, something that left empty homes and unanswered questions. She glanced around the office. Other women sat at their own desks, typing, filing, answering telephones. No one looked at each other. No one spoke unless necessary. The office was filled with the sound of industry, keys clacking, paper rustling, the occasional ring of a telephone. But it was a lonely sound, each person sealed in their own bubble of complicity. Marguerite began typing the list, name after name, address after address. Her face remained neutral, her expression carefully blank. But inside something twisted. A small voice, growing quieter with each passing day, asked, "What are you doing? How did you become this? When did typing a name become the same as sealing a fate? She had not always been this way." She remembered a time, not so long ago, when she had been a university student, studying literature, arguing philosophy late into the night with friends over cheap wine and cigarettes. She had dreamed of becoming a teacher, of sharing her love of words and ideas with young minds hungry for meaning. But the universities had changed. Professors had disappeared or been replaced. Curriculums had been rewritten. And slowly, imperceptibly, the world she had known had transformed into something unrecognizable. By the time she understood what was happening, it was too late. The doors had closed, the choices had narrowed, and she had taken this job because she needed to eat, needed a place to live, needed to survive. Survival. That was the word everyone clung to. It justified everything. It excused everything. It transformed people into instruments, into cogs in a vast machine that ground forward regardless of individual will. She finished typing the list and placed it in the outgoing tray. Her supervisor would sign it. It would be sent to another office. And somewhere, soon, the names on that list would hear a knock at their door. Marguerite stood and walked to the window, pressing her forehead against the cool glass. Below, in the courtyard, she could see workers on their lunch break, sitting on benches, eating sandwiches, smoking cigarettes. They looked so ordinary, so human. Did they carry the same weight she did? Did they lie awake at night, haunted by the small compliances that accumulated into something monstrous? In the countryside, far from the factories and offices, the work was different but no less demanding. Carl guided his plow through the field, the blade cutting through dark earth, turning it over in neat furrows. Behind him, his horse plodded steadily, its breath visible in the cool morning air, its muscles straining against the weight. Farming had always been hard work, but it had also been his own work. He had decided when to plant, what to grow, how much to harvest. But that autonomy was gone now. The state had quotas. The state demanded certain crops. The state took a percentage. No, not a percentage. The majority of everything he produced, leaving him just enough to feed his own family and maybe, if the season was good, a little to set aside. His sons were gone, both of them taken by the Wehrmacht and sent east. He received letters occasionally, brief and carefully worded, telling him nothing of substance. We are well, the food is adequate. We think of home. Letters written under watchful eyes, approved by censors, emptied of truth. His wife managed the house, cared for the animals, tended the garden that supplemented their rations. She was strong, his Helga, stronger than he had ever given her credit for. She carried her grief silently, channeling it into work, into the endless tasks that filled each day and left no room for despair. As Carl reached the end of the row and turned the plow, he noticed movement at the edge of the field. A figure, hunched and moving carefully, slipping between the trees. He stopped, his hand tightening on the plow handle, his eyes narrowing. It was not the first time. Over the past months, he had seen them occasionally, escaped prisoners of war, forced laborers who had fled from work camps, sometimes even German deserters, men who had decided they could no longer kill or watch others die. They moved through the countryside like shadows, desperate and dangerous, seeking food, shelter, a moment of safety in a world that offered none. The party had made it clear. Anyone harboring such people would be treated as traitors. The punishment was severe, final. Yet Carl stood there, watching the figure disappear into the woods, and did not call out, did not report, did not act. Was that resistance? Or simply the absence of collaboration? He did not know. He knew only that he was tired. Tired of the war, tired of the demands, tired of pretending that any of this made sense. He clicked his tongue, urging the horse forward, and continued his work. The field did not care about politics. The earth did not recognize flags or ideologies. It simply received the seed and, if conditions were right, gave back a harvest. There was something honest in that, something clean. At midday, Helga brought him lunch, bread, cheese, an apple from their small orchard. They sat together on a stone wall, eating in comfortable silence. She did not ask about the figure he had seen. He did not mention it. Some things were safer left unspoken. "The chickens are laying well," she said after a while. "We might have extra eggs this week." He nodded. Extra eggs meant they could trade with a neighbor, perhaps get some sugar or salt. Small luxuries that made life slightly more bearable. "I saw Frau Weber in the village yesterday," Helga continued, her voice careful. "Her husband was taken for questioning. They say he made a joke about the Führer." "Just a joke, Karl. And now she doesn't know if he'll come home." Karl chewed his bread slowly, his jaw working mechanically. "A joke, that's all it took now. A careless word, a moment of frustrated humor, and a life could be unmade. We must be careful," he said finally. "More careful than ever." Helga nodded, her eyes distant. "I wonder sometimes what kind of world our sons will come back to. If they come back." The unspoken fear hung between them, heavy as storm clouds. Karl reached over and took her hand, his thumb brushing over her knuckles, rough and worn from work. They sat like that for a long moment, two people holding on to each other in a world that seemed determined to tear everything apart. Then the moment passed. Lunch ended. Work resumed. The day continued its slow, relentless march toward evening. In the heart of Berlin, in a building that smelled of antiseptic and fear, Dr. Elisabeth Hoffman moved through hospital corridors with practiced efficiency. Her white coat was crisp, her stethoscope cold against her neck, her hands steady despite the exhaustion that had become her constant companion. She had been on duty for 16 hours, but the war did not respect human limitations. The wounded kept coming, and doctors like her kept working until they collapsed or were replaced. The hospital had changed. Once, it had been a place of healing for anyone who needed it. Now, there were hierarchies, classifications, invisible lines that determined who received care and who was turned away. Aryan Germans received priority. Party members received the best beds, the newest medicines, the most attention. Others, foreign workers, prisoners, those deemed less valuable, were treated only if resources allowed, which they rarely did. Elizabeth tried not to think about it. Thinking led to questioning, and questioning led to a dangerous place, a cliff edge where one might tumble into open defiance and never return. She focused on the work. Suture this wound. Set this bone. Administer this dose. One patient at a time. One breath at a time. She entered a ward where soldiers lay in neat rows, men pulled back from the Eastern Front, bodies broken, but spirits still clutched tight to ideology. Some slept fitfully, their faces twisted with pain or nightmare. Others stared at the ceiling with hollow eyes, seeing things that existed only in memory. A young soldier, barely 20, called out as she passed, "Doctor, doctor, please." She stopped at his bedside. His right arm was gone, amputated above the elbow, the stump bandaged and seeping. He would live, but the life he returned to would be smaller than the one he had left. "The pain," he whispered. It's still there. I can still feel my hand. I can feel my fingers moving, but when I look," his voice broke, phantom pain. She had seen it countless times. The nervous system still firing signals for limbs that no longer existed, the brain refusing to accept what the body already knew. "It will fade," she said gently, though she was not certain that was true. "In time, it will become easier to bear." He nodded, wanting to believe her, needing to believe her. "I want to go back," he said suddenly. "To the front. I can still fight. I can still serve the Führer." Elizabeth felt something inside her harden, a protective shell forming around her heart. This boy, because that's what he was, despite the uniform, despite the war, had given an arm and was willing to give more. He had been so thoroughly shaped by propaganda that even mutilation could not shake his faith. "Rest now," she said, adjusting his blanket. "Recovery first. Everything else can wait." She moved on before he could protest, before she could say something that might crack her carefully maintained facade. The ward stretched before her, bed after bed of broken bodies, each one a testament to the machinery of war. Each one a story of pain that would ripple through families, through communities, through time itself. In a small office adjacent to the ward, she found her colleague, Dr. Werner, slumped over a desk, his head in his hands. He looked up as she entered, his face gray with exhaustion and something deeper, a soul weariness that no amount of sleep could cure. "Another shipment came in this morning," he said quietly. "From the camps." Elizabeth's stomach tightened. She knew what he meant. Occasionally, the hospital received patients from the concentration camps, not to heal them, but to use them. Medical experiments, they were called. Research for the advancement of German medicine. The language was clinical, sanitized, designed to obscure the horror beneath. "I refused," Werner continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "I told them I wouldn't participate. They said if I refused again, I would be replaced. Or worse." Elizabeth sat down across from him, her own exhaustion momentarily forgotten. "What will you do?" He laughed, a bitter, broken sound. "What can I do? I have a wife, children. If I resist openly, they suffer. If I comply, I become something else. Something I won't recognize when I look in the mirror." The silence between them was heavy with shared understanding. They were both caught in the same trap, a web of compromises and moral calculations that tightened with each passing day. To resist was to risk everything. To comply was to lose everything that mattered. "We save who we can," Elizabeth said finally, "in the ways we can. It's not enough. It will never be enough. But it's what we have." Werner nodded slowly, though his eyes remained haunted. They sat together for a moment longer, two doctors in a hospital that had become a battleground not of weapons but of conscience. Before the demands of duty pulled them back into the corridors, back into the work that defined and damned them in equal measure. As the afternoon sun slanted through factory windows and office blinds, as fields were plowed and patients were tended, small acts of resistance flickered like distant stars. They were not grand gestures. They would not be written in history books or commemorated with monuments, but they mattered. In the factory, Friedrich allowed a foreign worker to rest an extra moment when the foreman wasn't looking. It was a tiny thing, barely 5 seconds, but the man's eyes met his with something like gratitude, and Friedrich felt a spark of his own humanity return. In the office, Marguerite made a mistake, deliberately, carefully. She transposed 2 digits in an identification number on the deportation list. The error would be caught eventually, perhaps. Or perhaps it would cause enough confusion to delay the process, to buy someone a few more days of freedom. She would never know. But she had done something, and that something made the next breath slightly easier to draw. In the countryside, Carl left a sack of potatoes at the edge of his field, near the woods where he had seen the figure moving. It would look like carelessness if anyone asked. But when he checked the next morning, the sack was gone. In the hospital, Dr. Hoffman slipped an extra dose of morphine to a prisoner who had been denied pain relief. Watching as the agony eased from his face, knowing that this small mercy could cost her everything if discovered, these were not heroes. They did not think of themselves as resistance fighters. They were simply people trying to hold on to some fragment of decency in a world designed to strip it away. They were exhausted, frightened, compromised, but they had not yet surrendered entirely. The workday stretched on, endless and exhausting. Machines hummed, typewriters clacked, plows turned earth, scalpels cut flesh, and throughout it all, the regime's machinery ground forward, efficient and relentless, transforming human labor into the fuel of conquest and control. As the sun began its descent, as workers prepared to leave factories and offices, as farmers washed their hands and doctors changed out of blood-stained coats, the day's accounting was tallied. How much produced? How much extracted? How much closer to victory or ruin? But there was another accounting, invisible and unrecorded. The accounting of small choices. Of moments when compassion flickered against cruelty. Of times when people chose to see each other as human rather than as categories, classifications, acceptable losses. The workday was ending, but its weight would be carried home, into kitchens and bedrooms, into the quiet hours when masks could finally fall away and people could confront what they had done, what they had failed to do, what they had become. The sun moved lower in the sky, casting long shadows across a nation at work. And in those shadows, both darkness and light persisted, locked in an eternal struggle that played out not on battlefields, but in the hearts of ordinary people doing ordinary work in extraordinary times. The second chapter was closing. But the day was not yet done. Evening was coming, with all its own demands and revelations. Chapter 3. The Children Growing Up Under the Swastika. The school bell rang at 3 o'clock, releasing children into the afternoon like birds from a cage. They spilled into the courtyard, their voices rising in a cacophony of youthful energy, their bodies finally free to move after hours of enforced stillness. But even in their play, even in their laughter, there was structure. There were rules. There were invisible lines that governed who played with whom, who spoke and who remained silent, who belonged and who was marked as other. Hans gathered his friends beneath the oak tree at the courtyard's edge, the same tree where generations of children had carved initials and whispered secrets. But the secrets now were different. The carvings had changed. Swastikas adorned the bark, rough and uneven, made by young hands eager to claim their place in the new order. "My father says we're going to win the war soon," Hans announced, his chest puffed with second-hand pride. "He says the Führer has a plan, and it's brilliant, and the enemies don't stand a chance." The other boys nodded eagerly, their faces bright with belief. War, to them, was still an adventure, still a story told through propaganda films and radio broadcasts, sanitized of blood and suffering, reduced to maps with arrows and victories announced in triumphant voices. "My brother sent a letter," another boy said. "He's in France. He said the French surrendered like cowards, and now we own Paris." They spoke of conquest as if it were a game, as if the countries colored on maps were simply pieces to be claimed, as if the people living there were abstract concepts rather than flesh and blood. They had been taught to think this way. The classroom had molded their minds like clay, shaping them into the future soldiers, the future believers, the future perpetrators of a system that required their innocence to fuel its machinery. Greta sat on the steps nearby, her school satchel beside her, watching them with eyes that held more questions than answers. She did not join in their games anymore. Something had shifted inside her, a dissonance that grew louder each day, a feeling that what she was being taught and what she felt in her heart were moving in opposite directions. She thought of her uncle again, the one who had vanished. She thought of the woman with the yellow star. She thought of the way her teacher's voice changed when speaking about certain people, the way it hardened, became clinical and cold, as if discussing insects rather than human beings. A girl approached her, younger by a year, with braids tied with red ribbons. Her name was Sophie, and she was new to the school, transferred from a village in the south after her father had been reassigned. "Why don't you play with them?" Sophie asked, gesturing toward the boys. Greta shrugged. "I don't want to. They say you're strange," Sophie said, not unkindly, simply stating a fact. "They say you don't sing loud enough during the anthem. They say your mother used to have Jewish friends." The words landed like stones. Greta felt her face flush, felt the familiar tightening in her chest. Even at 8 years old, she understood that accusations did not need to be true to be dangerous. They only needed to be spoken. "My mother had friends," Greta said quietly. "She doesn't anymore. They're gone." Sophie sat down beside her, their shoulders almost touching. For a moment, neither spoke. Around them, the courtyard continued its performance of normalcy. Children playing, teachers supervising, the rhythm of an ordinary afternoon. But beneath the surface, something else existed, something fragile and frightened. "My father doesn't talk about the war," Sophie whispered. "Not really. He comes home and he's quiet, and sometimes I hear him crying at night. My mother says it's because he's tired, but I think it's something else." Greta turned to look at her, this girl with her careful words and observant eyes. "Are you scared?" she asked. Sophie nodded slowly. "All the time, aren't you?" "Yes," Greta admitted, "but I don't know what I'm scared of exactly. It's like something is wrong, but everyone pretends it's right, and if you say anything, you become the wrong thing." They sat together in their shared fear, two children trying to make sense of a world that had stopped making sense, if it ever had. The bell rang again, signaling the end of recess, and they stood, shouldering their satchels, returning to classrooms where truth was whatever the state declared it to be. After school, Hans did not go home. Instead, he walked with purpose toward the youth center, a converted warehouse on the city's edge where the Hitler Youth held their meetings. He had been a member for 2 years now, ever since his 10th birthday, and it had become the center of his world. More than school, more than family, the Hitler Youth gave him identity, purpose, belonging. Inside, the space was cavernous and echoing. Banners hung from the rafters, red and black, the swastika emblazoned in white circles. Photographs of the Führer gazed down from the walls, his eyes stern and watchful. Rows of boys stood in formation, their uniforms identical, their postures straight, their faces serious with the weight of their perceived importance. The youth leader, a man in his 20s named Klaus, stood before them. He had been wounded on the Eastern Front, sent back with a medal and a limp, and now he poured his fervor into shaping the next generation. He was charismatic, energetic, able to make military drills feel like sacred rituals, able to transform children into zealots with the force of his conviction. "Today," Klaus announced, his voice ringing through the hall, "we practice for the Führer's birthday celebration. We will march through the city center. We will show the people what German youth looks like, strong, disciplined, ready to sacrifice everything for the fatherland." The boys erupted in cheers, their fists raised, their voices united. Hans felt it surge through him, that electric sense of being part of something larger, something historic. He was not just a boy from an ordinary family in an ordinary apartment. He was a soldier in waiting, a bearer of the future, chosen and special. They began their drills, left, right, arms swinging in perfect synchronization, heads held high, eyes forward. They marched until their legs ached, until sweat soaked through their shirts, until the movements became automatic, written into muscle memory. Klaus walked among them, correcting posture, praising precision, occasionally stopping to single out a boy for particular commendation or criticism. When he stopped in front of Hans, the boy's heart hammered with anticipation. "Good form, Hans," Klaus said, nodding approval. "You have the bearing of a true soldier." The Führer would be proud. Hans felt a warmth spread through his chest, a validation so powerful it erased every other need. This was what he had been searching for without knowing it: approval, recognition, a place where he mattered. After drills came lessons. They sat on hard wooden benches while Klaus spoke about duty, about sacrifice, about the destiny of the German people. He spoke of enemies both foreign and domestic, of the need for vigilance, of the importance of reporting anything suspicious, even if it came from neighbors, teachers, or family. "Loyalty to the Führer comes before all else," Klaus said, his eyes scanning the rows of young faces. "Before comfort, before friendship, even before family. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir," they shouted in unison. Hans absorbed every word. He believed it all. He had no reason not to. His world had been carefully constructed to eliminate doubt, to provide simple answers to complex questions, to make him feel powerful rather than powerless. And in that carefully constructed world, he thrived. Across the city, in a different kind of gathering, girls assembled in a community hall for their League of German Girls meeting. Unlike the militaristic energy of the Hitler Youth, the girls' organization focused on preparation for their future roles as mothers, homemakers, bearers of the next generation of pure German children. Greta sat among them, her hands folded in her lap, her expression carefully neutral. The leader, Fräulein Adler, stood at the front, young and earnest, her blonde hair braided in a crown around her head, her smile bright with conviction. "Today," Fräulein Adler said, "we will discuss the honor of German motherhood. Each of you carries within you the future of the Reich. Your bodies are not your own. They belong to the Volk, to the nation. It is your sacred duty to remain pure, to marry well, to bear healthy, Aryan children who will carry forward the greatness we are building." The girls listened with varying degrees of attention. Some hung on every word, their eyes shining with purpose. Others, like Greta, felt a creeping discomfort, a sense that something essential was being taken from them, some fundamental right to choose, to define themselves beyond biology and duty. They practiced domestic skills, sewing, cooking, cleaning. They learned songs about motherhood and sacrifice. They recited pledges about racial purity and national destiny. And woven through it all was the message that their value lay not in their minds or dreams, but in their capacity to produce the next generation of loyal citizens. During a break, Greta slipped outside, needing air, needing distance from the suffocating certainty that filled the hall. She stood in the alley beside the building, breathing slowly, trying to sort through the tangle of feelings inside her. Sophie found her there, having followed quietly. "You left," she said simply. "I needed to," Greta replied. They stood together in silence for a moment. Then Sophie spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "My grandmother told me stories before she died, stories about how things used to be. She said there was a time when people could think different things and it was okay. When you could disagree and still be neighbors. She said we're living in a nightmare, but we're all pretending it's a dream." Greta felt tears prick her eyes. "We can't talk like this. It's dangerous." "I know," Sophie said. "But I had to tell someone. I had to know I'm not the only one who feels like I'm drowning." Greta reached out and took Sophie's hand, squeezing it tightly. Two children, holding on to each other in the shadow of a building, sharing a secret that could destroy them both. It was a small act of rebellion, a whisper of resistance in a world that demanded absolute conformity. "We're not alone," Greta said softly. "We can't be. There have to be others who feel this way, who see what we see. But what can we do?" Sophie asked, and in her voice was the helplessness of youth, the terrible understanding that they were powerless against the machinery that surrounded them. "I don't know," Greta admitted, "but maybe just seeing it, just refusing to believe everything they tell us, maybe that's something. Maybe that's how it starts." They returned inside before their absence was noticed, slipping back into the formation, resuming their masks. But something had shifted. They had found each other. And in a world designed to isolate and control, that connection was a form of resistance, small and fragile but stubbornly alive. In the wealthier districts of the city, where trees-lined boulevards and homes stood 3 stories tall with wrought iron gates, another kind of childhood unfolded. Here, the children of party officials, high-ranking officers, and privileged families lived in a bubble of comfort that insulated them from the harsher realities of wartime Germany. Werner was 13, the son of an SS officer who rarely spoke of his work, but whose uniform commanded instant respect wherever they went. Werner attended an elite academy, a school reserved for those deemed racially superior and politically reliable. The education was rigorous, designed to produce the future leaders of the Reich. Administrators, military commanders, the architects of the 1,000-year empire they were promised. His classroom was not like Greta's or Hans's. The desks were polished oak. The textbooks were leather-bound and new. Portraits of great German thinkers hung on the walls, though carefully curated, scrubbed of anyone whose ideas contradicted the party line. They studied Latin and Greek, mathematics and science, but always through the lens of racial hierarchy and national destiny. Werner excelled. He had a quick mind, a competitive spirit, and an unconscious arrogance that came from never having to question his place in the world. He was being groomed for leadership, and he accepted this as naturally as he accepted the air he breathed. During physical education, they practiced not just sports but combat techniques, hand-to-hand fighting, weapons training, survival skills. They were being prepared for war, though it was presented as adventure, as the ultimate test of manhood and character. In the locker room after training, Werner's friend Dieter spoke in low, excited tones. "My father says they're opening new camps in the East. He says it's necessary work, keeping the Reich pure. He says our generation will inherit a world cleansed of weakness." Werner nodded, toweling sweat from his hair. He had heard similar conversations many times. His own father spoke little of specifics, but the words he did use, necessary measures, final solutions, the difficult work of greatness, carried weight, implied things that Werner did not fully understand, but accepted as part of the larger mission. "Do you ever wonder what it's like?" another boy asked. "The camps, I mean. What happens there?" A brief silence fell. It was a question that brushed too close to something unspoken, something that existed in the margins of their consciousness, but was never examined directly. "Does it matter?" Dieter said finally. "Whatever happens, it's for the good of Germany." "That's what matters." The others murmured agreement, and the conversation moved on. But Werner felt a small flicker of something, not quite doubt, not yet, but a momentary discomfort, like a stone in his shoe. He pushed it away. Questioning served no purpose. His path was clear, his future assured. Why complicate it with uncertainties? After school, he returned home to a house that smelled of furniture polish and fresh flowers. His mother was in the parlor, entertaining other officers' wives, their laughter tinkling like glass. A maid brought tea on a silver tray. Everything was ordered, elegant, insulated from the chaos beyond their walls. Werner went to his room, a spacious chamber with his own desk, his own bookshelf, his own gramophone. He had privileges that most German children could only dream of, and he knew it. But privilege came with expectations. He was expected to excel, to lead, to embody the ideals of the master race. He sat at his desk and opened his journal, a leather-bound book where he recorded his thoughts and aspirations. He wrote about his desire to serve, to make his father proud, to be worthy of the faith placed in him. He wrote with sincerity, with genuine belief. He had been raised in a world where good and evil were clearly defined, where his side was righteous by definition, where doubt was weakness and certainty was strength. But as he wrote, his pen paused. He thought of something he had seen the previous week, a transport truck passing through the streets, filled with people pressed against barred windows, their faces gaunt and frightened. He had looked away quickly, as everyone did. But the image lingered, uninvited, uncomfortable. He shook his head, forcing the thought away. Such things were not for him to question. His duty was to prepare, to become the leader he was meant to be, to trust that those above him knew what was necessary. He closed the journal and turned on his gramophone, filling the room with music, Wagner, powerful and sweeping, music that spoke of heroes and destiny. He let it wash over him, drowning out the small, persistent voice that had begun to whisper questions he did not want to answer. Not all children fit neatly into categories. Some existed in the spaces between, in the gray areas where identity became complicated and survival became a daily negotiation. Ruth was 11, and she lived in the basement apartment of a building on the city's edge. Officially, she did not exist. Her papers had been destroyed a year ago when her family had gone into hiding. Her parents had been taken anyway, discovered and deported. But Ruth had been at a neighbor's house that night, a stroke of luck that felt more like curse. The neighbor, Frau Klein, was an elderly woman whose husband had died in the First War and whose only son had been killed in this one. She was bitter, exhausted, and alone, but she had not turned Ruth in. Perhaps it was compassion. Perhaps it was simply the human need to have someone to care for. Whatever the reason, Ruth remained a ghost in her own city. She did not go to school. She did not play in the streets. She spent her days in the dim basement, reading old books by candlelight, learning arithmetic from Frau Klein, living on potatoes and stale bread and the occasional luxury of an egg. She had not felt sunlight on her face in months. Her skin was pale, her body thin, her eyes too old for her years. At night, she listened to the sounds above, footsteps on the stairs, voices in the courtyard, occasionally the wail of air raid sirens and the distant thunder of bombs. The war was coming closer, even here, even to those who thought themselves safe. Frau Klein told her stories sometimes in the evening hours when the silence grew too heavy. Stories of a different time, when the city had been vibrant and diverse, when her husband's best friend had been Jewish, and no one had thought twice about it. Stories of how things had changed slowly, then suddenly, like a pot of water that boils gradually until it's too late to notice. "You must remember," Frau Klein said one evening, her voice hoarse with age and sorrow. "When this is over, if this ever ends, you must remember what happened. Not to seek revenge, but to bear witness, so that people cannot pretend they did not know." Ruth nodded, though the idea of a future beyond this basement seemed impossibly distant. She existed in a perpetual present, each day a challenge of simply continuing to breathe, to remain hidden, to not make noise when neighbors passed by. She thought of other children her age, children who walked freely in daylight, who went to schools and youth meetings, who believed in the promises being made to them. She wondered what they thought of children like her, if they thought of them at all, or if she and her kind had been successfully erased from their consciousness, reduced to abstract threats rather than human beings. Sometimes, late at night when sleep would not come, Ruth allowed herself to remember. Her mother's hands braiding her hair, her father's voice reading stories at bedtime, the smell of challah baking on Friday evenings. A life that felt like a dream now, distant and unreal. She did not hate the children who had inherited the world she had been expelled from. She could not afford the energy for hate, but she felt a profound sadness for them, for the poison they were being fed, for the darkness being planted in their hearts. They were victims too, she thought, even if they did not know it. Victims of a system that twisted love into hate, that made cruelty seem like duty. In her basement hiding place, Ruth represented a truth that the regime desperately wanted to erase, that she was still here, still human, still holding on to hope despite everything designed to destroy it. Her existence was an act of resistance, even if no one but Frau Klein knew she existed. As evening approached and children across the city returned home, a pattern emerged, a mosaic of different childhoods, each shaped by the same forces but experienced in vastly different ways. Hans returned home energized, filled with purpose, ready to tell his parents about the upcoming parade. Werner studied in his comfortable room, confident in his place at the top of the hierarchy. Greta walked slowly, her mind troubled, carrying questions she could not voice. Sophie held on to the memory of shared understanding, a fragile lifeline. Ruth remained hidden, a ghost in the basement, waiting for a future that might never come. These were the children of Nazi Germany, believers and doubters, privileged and persecuted, shaped by propaganda and scarred by truth. Some would grow into the perpetrators of tomorrow, others would carry the wounds of survival. Still, others would not survive at all, their potential extinguished before it could bloom. The tragedy was not just in what was done to them, but in what they were being made to do to themselves, to each other. Childhood, that precious time of wonder and innocence, had been weaponized, turned into a training ground for ideology, a factory for producing the next generation of true believers or broken victims. As the sun set and families gathered for evening meals, as windows glowed warm against the darkening sky, the children of the Reich carried within them the seeds of both its future and its eventual reckoning. They were being taught to see the world in black and white, us versus them, strength versus weakness. But in some hearts, despite everything, color persisted. Doubt flickered. Questions took root. The third chapter was drawing to a close, but its implications would echo through generations. The children would grow. The war would end. And someday, they would have to reckon with what they had believed, what they had done, what they had witnessed in silence. But that reckoning was still years away. For now, they were simply children, trying to navigate a world that asked too much of them, that stole their innocence and replaced it with ideology or trauma, or a confusing mixture of both. Night was falling, and in the darkness, childhood continued its complicated dance between indoctrination and intuition, between what they were told and what they felt, between the future they were promised and the one that was actually coming. Chapter 4: The Evenings, Propaganda, Entertainment, and Hidden Truths. The evening arrived with a softness that belied the tension it carried. Across the city, lights flickered on in windows, casting warm squares of yellow against the deepening blue. Families gathered in their living rooms, their kitchens, their small spaces made smaller by blackout curtains that kept the light from escaping, kept the warmth from reaching the world outside. The day's mask could not yet come off, not entirely. The evening had its own performances, its own rituals of control and compliance. At precisely 7 o'clock, radios hummed to life in homes throughout the Reich. It was not a choice, not really. The broadcasts were expected, anticipated, woven into the fabric of daily routine as naturally as breathing. To not listen was to mark oneself as suspicious, as disconnected from the national project, as potentially dangerous. The voice that emerged from the speakers was smooth, authoritative, almost hypnotic in its certainty. It spoke of victories on distant fronts, of brave soldiers pushing forward, of the inevitable triumph of German will over lesser peoples. Numbers were announced, enemy casualties, territory gained, resources secured. The numbers were often fabricated, exaggerated, designed not to inform but to inspire, to maintain the illusion of perpetual progress. In Hans's apartment, the family sat together on worn furniture, their faces lit by the radio's glow. His father leaned forward, his expression serious, nodding occasionally as if in conversation with the voice. His mother darned socks, her hands moving automatically while her eyes remained distant, thoughts traveling to places she would never speak aloud. Hans listened with rapt attention, his young mind absorbing every word as gospel truth. "You see?" his father said during a pause in the broadcast. "We are winning. The Führer knows what he's doing. By next year, this will all be over, and Germany will be the greatest nation the world has ever seen." Hans believed him. Why wouldn't he? His father spoke with conviction. The radio confirmed it. His teachers taught it. His youth leader embodied it. Every voice in his world sang the same song, and the harmony was so complete, so overwhelming, that the possibility of discord never entered his mind. But in other homes, the evening broadcasts were received differently. In Greta's apartment, her mother listened with a tightness around her mouth, her jaw clenched, her eyes occasionally flicking to her daughter as if measuring how much poison was seeping in. Her father sat silent, his newspaper held up like a shield, though his eyes did not move across the words. They were frozen, staring at nothing, while his mind traveled to memories of friends who had disappeared, of colleagues who had stopped coming to work, of the slow erosion of everything he had once believed about civilization. When the news portion ended, entertainment began. A dramatic serial played out over the airwaves, a story of brave German soldiers and the women who waited for them, of sacrifice and honor and love tested by war. The acting was melodramatic, the emotions heightened, the messages clear. Suffering was noble, waiting was duty, and the reward for faith would come in the glorious future being built by their collective sacrifice. Greta listened but did not hear. Her mind was elsewhere, replaying the conversation with Sophie, thinking about the questions that grew louder each day, wondering how many other people sat in their homes, listening to the same broadcasts, feeling the same disconnection between what they were told and what they knew in their bones to be true. After the radio programs ended, a different kind of evening entertainment beckoned. The cinema was still a refuge, still a place where people could lose themselves for a few hours, though what they lost themselves in had changed dramatically. The films that played on German screens were carefully curated, each one approved by the Ministry of Propaganda, each one designed to serve a purpose beyond mere entertainment. The theater on Friedrichstrasse was packed, as it was most evenings. People lined up outside, their ration cards ready, their faces showing the weariness of the day but also the anticipation of escape. Inside, the lobby smelled of stale popcorn and too many bodies pressed into too small a space. Posters plastered the walls, images of heroic soldiers, beautiful Aryan families, enemies depicted as grotesque caricatures. Tonight's feature was a love story, a romance between a soldier and a nurse set against the backdrop of the war. It was designed to be inspiring, uplifting, a reminder that even in darkness, German spirit prevailed. The characters were archetypes rather than people, the noble warrior, the devoted woman, the wise commander, the cowardly enemy. Marguerite sat in the darkness, surrounded by strangers, watching the images flicker across the screen. She had come alone, needing to be away from her apartment, away from the typewriter and the lists and the complicity that accumulated like dust on every surface of her life. She had hoped the film would provide genuine escape, a few hours where she could forget. But the propaganda was too obvious, too heavy-handed. Every scene was calculated, every emotion manipulated. The soldier was impossibly brave, never showing real fear or doubt. The nurse was impossibly pure, her devotion absolute. Their love was a metaphor for loyalty to the state, their separation a noble sacrifice for the greater good. Around her, people wept. She could hear the sniffles, see the handkerchiefs dabbing at eyes. They were moved, genuinely affected. The film was working exactly as intended, transforming their exhaustion and fear into something that felt like purpose, like meaning. Marguerite felt nothing but a hollow ache. She wondered when she had become so numb, when the ability to be moved by stories had been replaced by cynical analysis. Or perhaps it wasn't numbness at all. Perhaps it was clarity, the ability to see the machinery behind the illusion, to recognize manipulation for what it was. When the film ended and the lights came up, the audience applauded. They filed out into the night, their faces softened, their spirits momentarily lifted. They would return to their homes, their rations, their fears. But for a few hours, they had been given relief, and the regime had reinforced its messages without ever seeming to lecture. Marguerite walked home through streets that were darker than they used to be, the blackout regulations ensuring that even starlight felt like extravagance. She thought about the power of stories, how they could be used to illuminate truth or to obscure it, how the same medium that once made her want to teach and inspire was now being used to control and manipulate. In wealthier homes, evening entertainment took different forms. Werner's family gathered in their spacious living room where a gramophone played classical music and refreshments were served on delicate china. His father had returned from wherever his work took him, still in uniform, his face unreadable behind a mask of professional composure. Guests arrived, other officers and their wives, men whose names Werner recognized from newspapers and radio broadcasts. They spoke in low voices about matters Werner was not privy to, their conversations pausing whenever he passed near, resuming only when he moved out of earshot. He sat in a corner, pretending to read, but actually listening, catching fragments of conversation that painted a picture more complex than the one presented in school or youth meetings. "The Eastern Front is not going as well as the broadcasts claim," one officer said quietly. "We're losing men faster than we can replace them. The cold, the terrain, the sheer size of it." "Careful," another interrupted, his eyes flicking toward the door. "Walls have ears, even in homes like these." The first officer lowered his voice further. "I'm simply saying that we must be realistic. The Führer's vision is brilliant, but implementation faces challenges." Werner felt a small tremor of something, not quite doubt, but a hairline crack in the certainty he had been raised to embrace. These were loyal men, devoted servants of the Reich, and yet they spoke of difficulties, of challenges, of things not going according to plan. His father noticed him listening and cleared his throat pointedly. Werner quickly returned his attention to his book, his face carefully neutral, but his mind raced. Was the victory he had been promised not as certain as he had believed? Were the broadcasts not entirely truthful? And if they lied about that, what else might they be lying about? He pushed the thoughts away. Doubt was dangerous. Doubt was weakness. His father had not raised him to be weak. He focused on the music instead, letting Wagner's thunderous crescendos fill his mind and drown out the whispers of uncertainty. While some gathered in drawing rooms and cinemas, others huddled in hidden spaces, engaging in the most dangerous form of evening entertainment, the consumption of forbidden information. In a cramped attic across town, 4 men and 2 women sat in near darkness, their faces illuminated only by the faint glow of a radio, not the state-controlled broadcasts that filled every sanctioned home, but a foreign signal, illegal and punishable by death. The radio crackled with static as they tuned it carefully, searching for the BBC, for Radio Moscow, for any voice that might tell them something approaching truth. These were members of a resistance cell, though they would never use such a grandiose term for themselves. They were simply people who refused to stop asking questions, who could not accept the official narrative, who risked everything for the chance to hear a different story. The voice that emerged from the static spoke in German, but with a foreign accent. It reported news from the war fronts, news that contradicted the triumphant proclamations of German radio. It spoke of defeats, retreats, mounting casualties. It spoke of atrocities being committed in occupied territories, of mass killings, of systematic extermination. The listeners sat in stunned silence. Some of them had suspected, had heard rumors, had seen things that didn't align with official explanations. But hearing it stated so plainly, so matter-of-factly, was different. It made it real in a way that suspicion never could. "Can we believe this?" one woman whispered. "Is this not also propaganda, just from the other side?" An older man, a former journalist who had lost his position years ago for asking the wrong questions, shook his head slowly. "Propaganda contains truth, even when it lies. The question is not whether to believe everything we hear, but whether to question everything we're told. These broadcasts give us context, alternative perspectives. We can compare, analyze, think for ourselves." Another man, younger, his hands trembling, spoke with barely controlled emotion. "If even half of what they're saying is true, if even a fraction, then we are complicit. All of us. Every day we go to work, pay our taxes, follow orders, we are part of it." The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of that realization. Complicity was not an abstraction. It was concrete, personal, undeniable. It was the work their hands performed, the words their mouths spoke, the willful ignorance their minds maintained to survive. "What can we do?" the woman asked, and in her voice was both desperation and determination. "Small things," the journalist said. "We distribute pamphlets. We whisper truths to those who might listen. We help where we can, hiding people, forging documents, sabotaging when opportunity presents. We bear witness. And we prepare for the day when this regime falls, because it will fall. All empires built on lies eventually collapse under the weight of their own contradictions." They continued listening until the broadcast ended, then carefully hid the radio beneath floorboards, each person committing to memory what they had heard, knowing that written notes were too dangerous. They dispersed one by one, leaving at intervals, returning to their ordinary lives, carrying extraordinary secrets. These were the hidden evenings, the ones that existed in margins and shadows, the quiet acts of resistance that would never be announced on radio broadcasts or celebrated in cinemas, but that maintained a thread of truth in a world drowning in lies. In the basement where Ruth hid, evening was the most dangerous time. Above her, the building came alive with the sounds of residents returning from work, preparing meals, living lives she could only imagine. Every footstep on the floor above her head was a potential threat. Every raised voice a possible discovery. Every knock at Frau Klein's door a moment of pure terror. She sat very still in her corner, a blanket wrapped around her thin shoulders, listening. Frau Klein had gone upstairs to her own apartment hours ago, leaving Ruth with a cup of weak soup and a piece of bread. The old woman could not stay in the basement for long without arousing suspicion. Her absences were Ruth's loneliest hours. Ruth had learned to measure time by sounds. The neighbors in apartment 3B always argued at 7:30, their voices rising and falling in familiar patterns. The family in 4A listened to the radio broadcasts religiously, and she could hear the tinny voice of the announcer through the thin walls. By 8 o'clock, children were being put to bed, their protests and lullabies filtering down through the building's bones. She had a single candle, but she rarely dared to light it. Instead, she sat in darkness, her mind creating worlds more vivid than anything she could see. She remembered stories her father had told her, tales from Jewish tradition mixed with fairy tales and adventures. She recited them to herself, polishing the words like precious stones, keeping them alive in her memory so they wouldn't disappear entirely. Sometimes she composed letters in her head, letters to her parents, wherever they were, if they still existed at all. "Dear Mama and Papa," she would begin silently. "I am still here. I am still alive. Frau Klein is kind, though I know I am a burden. I try to be quiet, to take up as little space as possible, to justify the risk she takes for me. I hope you are together, wherever you are. I hope you know I haven't forgotten. I hope you're proud of me for surviving." The letters never ended with conclusions, only pauses. There was no way to send them, no address to write on envelopes that didn't exist. They were simply exercises in maintaining connection to people who might already be ghosts. Around 9 o'clock, she heard a sound that made her blood freeze, heavy boots on the stairs, the kind worn by police or soldiers. They stopped on the floor above. There was knocking, authoritative and demanding. Voices muffled but urgent, more knocking. Ruth pressed herself against the wall, making herself as small as possible, her hand covering her mouth to muffle even her breathing. She had practiced this countless times, the art of becoming invisible, of ceasing to exist even to herself. The boots moved again, going from door to door. They were searching for something or someone. Ruth's heart hammered so loudly she was certain it would give her away, that the sound would penetrate the ceiling and draw them down into her hiding place. The boots stopped outside Frau Klein's apartment. The knock came, sharp and impatient. Ruth heard the old woman's voice, confused and elderly, playing the part perfectly. "Yes? Who is it? It's rather late. Papers inspection." Open the door. The sound of locks turning. The creak of hinges. Footsteps entering the apartment directly above Ruth's head. She could hear them moving through rooms, opening closets, checking spaces. They were thorough. "You live alone?" a male voice asked. Yes, my husband and son are both gone. It's just me now. Have you seen any suspicious activity in the building? Anyone hiding unauthorized persons? A pause. Ruth held her breath, her entire existence suspended in that moment of silence. "No," Frau Klein said finally, her voice steady. "Nothing unusual, just the same neighbors I've always had. We keep to ourselves mostly." The footsteps moved around the apartment again, slower this time, more deliberate. Ruth heard drawers being opened, the sound of papers being shuffled. Then, blessedly, the footsteps retreated to the door. "Report anything suspicious immediately. There are enemies among us, even in buildings like this. Vigilance is every citizen's duty, of course. Heil Hitler! Heil Hitler!" The door closed. The boots moved on to the next apartment, then the next, gradually climbing to higher floors. Ruth remained frozen for long minutes after the sounds faded, unable to move, unable to believe she was still safe. Eventually, she heard a soft tap on the floor above. Frau Klein signaled that it was over, that the danger had passed. But Ruth knew it was never truly over. This was her evening, every evening, a tightrope walk over an abyss, where one wrong sound, one moment of carelessness, could end everything. She pulled the blanket tighter and tried to find comfort in the darkness. Above her, the building settled back into its routines. Radios hummed, children slept, and Ruth existed in the space between, neither fully alive nor completely erased, a ghost haunting her own city, waiting for a liberation that grew more distant with each passing night. As the evening deepened toward night, different rituals unfolded in different homes. In some, families gathered for readings, passages from Mein Kampf, studied like scripture, discussed with reverence and conviction. Children were taught to see the world through the Führer's eyes, to internalize his hatreds and ambitions as their own. In others, banned books were brought out from hiding places, volumes of poetry, philosophy, fiction that contradicted the approved narratives. Parents read quietly to children who were old enough to understand the risk, passing on ideas that the state wanted extinguished. These were acts of cultural resistance, attempts to preserve something essential that was being systematically destroyed. Friedrich, the factory worker, sat at his small kitchen table, a bottle of schnapps before him. He poured a glass and stared at it, watching the liquid catch the dim light. His wife had gone to bed early, exhausted from her own day of work and rationing and making do. He was alone with his thoughts, and his thoughts were not good company. He thought about the shells he built, about where they went and what they did. He thought about the foreign workers in the factory, their hollow eyes and skeletal frames. He thought about his own silence, his own complicity, the small moral compromises that accumulated into something larger and darker than he wanted to acknowledge. He had been a good man once. He was certain of that. He had helped neighbors, contributed to his community, lived according to values instilled by parents who had believed in human dignity. When had that changed? When had doing nothing become the same as doing something terrible? The schnapps burned going down, but it did nothing to ease the burning in his conscience. He poured another glass and another, seeking oblivion but finding only clarity, the terrible, unwanted clarity of a man who could no longer hide from himself. In the hospital, Dr. Hoffman finished her shift and walked through empty corridors, her footsteps echoing against tile floors. She passed the ward where the experiments were conducted, the one she had refused to enter. The door was closed, but she knew what lay beyond it, and that knowledge sat in her stomach like lead. She thought about the Hippocratic oath she had taken. First, do no harm. How quaint that seemed now. How impossibly idealistic in a world where harm was systematized, industrialized, made mundane through bureaucratic efficiency. She stopped at a window overlooking the city, her reflection ghostly in the dark glass. Who was she? What had she become? The questions had no easy answers, only the weight of accumulated choices, each one seemingly small at the time, but together forming a pattern she could no longer pretend not to see. At precisely 10 o'clock, air raid sirens began to wail across the city. The sound was mournful, rising and falling like some ancient creature crying out in warning. Lights extinguished. Families grabbed emergency bags and hurried to cellars, to shelters, to whatever protection they could find. The war was coming home. The bombs that had fallen on other cities, on other peoples, were now falling here, on German soil, turning the abstract into the devastatingly concrete. In the shelters, people huddled together, class distinctions temporarily erased by shared fear. Rich and poor, party members and quiet dissenters, children and elderly, all pressed together in the dark, waiting for the explosions, hoping their building would not be the one struck tonight. Hans sat with his family, his earlier confidence shaken by the visceral reality of bombs falling from the sky. The propaganda had told him Germany was invincible, that victory was assured. But bombs did not care about promises or ideology. They simply fell and destroyed, indiscriminate and absolute. Werner and his family sat in their private shelter, better equipped than most, stocked with supplies and comfortable furnishings. But comfort could not eliminate fear. His father sat rigid, his uniform still perfectly pressed, his face a mask of calm that did not quite reach his eyes. His mother clutched a photograph of her parents long dead, whispering prayers she had been taught as a child before religion became suspect. Greta held her mother's hand, feeling it tremble despite her mother's attempts to appear strong. In the darkness, surrounded by neighbors she barely knew, she felt a strange sense of connection, not to ideology or nation, but to simple, shared humanity. They were all afraid. They all wanted to survive. In that moment, the division seemed arbitrary, meaningless. The bombs fell for 20 minutes, each explosion shaking the earth, rattling the shelter walls, reminding everyone of their fragility. Then, gradually, the sounds faded. The all-clear siren sounded, its steady tone both relief and reminder. This was not over. This would happen again. People emerged into a city changed. Somewhere, buildings were on fire. Somewhere, families were digging through rubble, searching for loved ones. Somewhere, the evening's entertainment had turned into nightmare. But in most places, life continued. People returned to their homes, checked for damage, tried to resume their interrupted routines. The evening's final act was this forced return to normalcy, this collective pretense that everything was fine, that tomorrow would come and life would go on, that the promises made by leaders were still valid despite evidence to the contrary. As midnight approached and the city finally settled into fitful sleep, the evening's true purpose had been fulfilled. Through entertainment and propaganda, through fear and false comfort, through the thousand small mechanisms of control, the regime had maintained its grip for another day. Some believed more fervently than before. Others doubted more deeply, and most simply endured, caught between belief and disbelief, between collaboration and resistance, between hope and despair. The evening was ending, but its lessons, its manipulations and its truths, its entertainments and its terrors would carry into dreams, shaping the unconscious in ways even more profound than the waking hours. Night was falling fully now, and in the darkness, the real reckonings would begin. Chapter 5: The Night, Fear, Hope, and the Weight of Silence. The night settled over the city like a held breath. In the hours past midnight, when even the most vigilant grew weary, when the streets emptied and the world seemed to pause between one day and the next, a different reality emerged. The masks people wore throughout the day could finally slip, just slightly, in the privacy of darkness. But even then, even in the supposed sanctuary of night, fear remained a constant companion, patient and unforgiving. In the modest apartment where Hans slept, his mother lay awake beside her husband, staring at the ceiling. Her mind traveled paths she would never speak aloud, not even to the man breathing steadily beside her. She thought of her son, so eager, so convinced, so willing to believe everything he was told. She remembered her own childhood when mornings had been softer, when neighbors had been simply neighbors rather than potential informants, when the future had seemed open rather than prescribed. She wondered what kind of man Hans would become. Would he carry this fervor into adulthood, becoming one of the true believers who never questioned, never wavered? Or would something crack the shell of certainty, letting doubt and empathy seep in? And which outcome terrified her more, that he would remain blind, or that he would see clearly and have to live with the weight of what his nation had done? Her husband stirred, sensing her wakefulness. "You should sleep," he murmured. "Tomorrow will be long. Tomorrow is always long," she replied softly. He was quiet for a moment, then spoke with unusual candor, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know you have doubts. I know you see things differently than I say I do. But please, keep them hidden. For Hans, for us. The world is not safe for doubt. She turned to look at him in the darkness, surprised by this admission, this acknowledgement that he too wore a mask. Do you believe what you say to him? About the war, about victory, about all of it. Another pause, longer this time. I believe what I must believe to get through each day. Isn't that what we all do? It was not an answer, not really. But it was as close to honesty as they could afford, even here, even in the supposed intimacy of their shared bed. She reached for his hand and held it. Two people connected by marriage and circumstance, separated by all the things they could never say. In the next room, Hans dreamed of parades and medals, of becoming a hero in a war that was already slipping away from the narrative he had been taught. His sleep was restless, punctuated by sounds he could not quite identify. Distant engines, muffled voices, the city's nighttime symphony playing beneath his unconsciousness. Across the city, in the shadows between street lamps that had been dimmed for blackout regulations, movement stirred. The Gestapo worked best at night. They had learned that darkness magnified fear, that the sound of boots on stairs at 3 in the morning shattered resistance before a single question was asked. Tonight, they came for a family on Lindenstrasse, a dentist, his wife, their 2 teenage daughters. The charges were vague, as they often were. Defeatist talk, failure to display proper enthusiasm for the war effort, suspicious associations. The evidence was thinner still. A neighbor's report, a comment taken out of context, the arbitrary whim of a system that ran on denunciations and suspicion. The knock came not as a request, but as a command. 3 sharp raps, then the door handle turning, already unlocked from the outside. They had keys to everything, access to everywhere. The family was pulled from sleep, given minutes to dress, told to pack 1 suitcase each. No explanations were offered. No destination was revealed. The daughters cried quietly, trying to be brave, trying to understand what was happening through the fog of interrupted sleep and surging adrenaline. The mother moved mechanically, folding clothes with trembling hands, her mind racing through possibilities. Was there someone she could call? Some appeal she could make? Some mistake she could correct? The father stood in his nightshirt, suddenly old, his authority as head of household revealed as the fiction it had always been. He tried to speak, to ask questions, to assert some dignity in the face of this violation. But the words died in his throat when he met the eyes of the officer in charge, cold, bored, utterly indifferent to his humanity. They were led down the stairs and into a waiting truck. Neighbors' curtains twitched, but did not open. Doors remained closed. No one intervened. No one spoke. The night absorbed the family's departure as if they had never existed. And by morning, their apartment would be sealed, their possessions catalogued, their absence explained away with official stamps and bureaucratic efficiency. This was happening in a dozen places tonight, in 100 places across the Reich. The night was when the regime did its darkest work, when people were disappeared, when the machinery of terror operated most efficiently. And in the morning, those who remained would wake and go about their business, pretending not to notice the empty apartments, the missing faces, the gaps where lives used to be. In the basement, Ruth heard them pass. The truck's engine rumbled in the street outside, and she knew what it meant. She had heard that sound before, too many times, each one a reminder of how precarious her own existence was, how thin the membrane between hidden and discovered. She pulled her blanket tighter, though it provided no real warmth, no real protection. She thought about the family being taken. She did not know them, could not see them, but she felt a kinship born of shared persecution. They were being erased, just as she had been erased, just as thousands upon thousands had been erased before them. Sometimes in the deepest part of night, Ruth wondered if she should feel grateful for her survival. But gratitude seemed obscene when survival meant hiding in a basement while others were taken, when living required becoming invisible, when each breath felt like an act of theft from those who no longer breathed. She thought about God, a concept that had become complicated and painful. Her parents had been faithful, observant, their lives structured around traditions that reached back through centuries. Where was God now? In this basement? In the trucks that came at night? In the camps whose existence was whispered about but never confirmed? She did not have answers. She had only questions that multiplied in the darkness, that pressed against her mind like physical weight. And beneath all the questions was a deeper truth that she wanted to live. Despite everything, despite the world's cruelty and the night's terrors, she wanted to wake up tomorrow, wanted to feel sunlight on her face again someday, wanted a future that seemed impossible, but that she could not stop hoping for. Hope was both her strength and her torment. It kept her going, but it also made each night harder to bear, each sound more frightening, each moment of continued survival more miraculous and more unbearable. Above her, Frau Klein's footsteps creaked across the floor, the old woman also awake, also listening, also measuring the night's dangers. Ruth wondered what Frau Klein thought about in these dark hours. Did she regret taking in a Jewish child? Did she lie awake calculating risks, wondering if today would be the day they were discovered? Or was her motivation simpler, more fundamental, a refusal to let humanity die completely, even when the world seemed determined to extinguish it? Ruth would never ask. Some things were better left unspoken, left in the realm of action rather than words. Frau Klein's nightly pacing was answer enough. She too was afraid, but she had not turned Ruth in, had not abandoned her, had chosen danger over safety because some moral line still existed inside her that could not be crossed. In wealthier districts, the night held different terrors. Werner's father sat in his study, door closed, a glass of cognac in his hand. Expensive, rationed, saved for moments when the weight became too heavy to carry without some form of anesthetic. He had returned late from his office, from work he never discussed, from places his family never asked about. He had removed his uniform and put on civilian clothes, but he could not remove what he carried inside, the knowledge of what he was part of, what he facilitated, what his signatures authorized. He was not a monster, or at least he did not think of himself as one. He had a family he loved. He had been a good student, a patriotic citizen, a man who believed in order and duty. How had those qualities led him here, to this study, to this cognac, to nights spent trying to drink himself into enough numbness to sleep? The orders came from above. He simply implemented them. That was the story he told himself, the narrative that allowed him to function. He was a cog in a machine, not the architect of it. His individual actions were small, administrative, removed from the actual violence. Signing papers was not the same as pulling triggers, was not the same as operating gas chambers, was not the same as the things that happened in places whose names he knew but tried not to think about. But in the night, when the justifications grew thin, he could not escape the mathematics of his complicity. His signatures multiplied into thousands of lives. His efficiency improved the machinery of death. His silence granted permission, and no amount of cognac could wash away the stain that was spreading through his soul like ink through water. He thought about his son, sleeping peacefully upstairs, dreaming of becoming a leader, of serving the Reich with honor. Werner had no idea what his father actually did, what serving the Reich truly meant. The boy lived in the clean, abstracted world of propaganda and ideology. He had never seen the reality, never smelled the smoke, never heard the sounds that haunted his father's dreams. Should he tell him? Should he shatter that innocence before it calcified into something harder, more dangerous? Or was ignorance a form of mercy, a way to preserve some part of his son that might survive into whatever came after? The questions had no answers, only the weight of impossible choices. He poured another glass and stared at the books lining his study walls: philosophy, literature, history. He had been educated in the great tradition of Western thought, had studied ethics and morality, had written papers about Kant and duty. How hollow it all seemed now. How completely his education had failed to prepare him for moral clarity when it mattered most. In the hospital, the night shift moved through dimly lit corridors with practiced efficiency. Dr. Hoffman walked among the sleeping and the dying, checking vitals, adjusting medications, offering what comfort she could to those who lay awake in pain or fear. She stopped at the bed of a young soldier who had been brought in that afternoon, his injuries severe, his prognosis poor. He was awake, his eyes fever-bright, his breathing labored. "Doctor," he whispered as she approached, "am I going to die?" She wanted to lie, to offer false comfort, to tell him he would be fine. But something in his eyes demanded honesty. He was perhaps 19, barely more than a child, and he deserved truth in whatever time remained. "I don't know," she said gently, taking his hand. "Your injuries are serious. We're doing everything we can." He nodded slowly, accepting this. I thought it would mean something. Dying for the fatherland. They told us it would be glorious, that we would be heroes. But I just feel scared and cold. And I want my mother. Tears slipped down his temples into his hair. Elizabeth squeezed his hand, her own eyes burning. This was the truth beneath the propaganda, beneath the stirring speeches and martial music. Young men dying in pain, wanting their mothers, discovering too late that glory was a lie and death was simply death. "What's your mother's name?" she asked softly. "Anna Richter. From Stuttgart. Tell me about her." And so he did, his voice growing weaker as he spoke of a woman who baked bread on Sundays, who sang while doing laundry, who had cried when he left for the front but told him she was proud. He spoke until his voice faded into ragged breathing, until the memories became confused with fever dreams, until finally his hand went slack in hers and his eyes stared at nothing. Elizabeth closed his eyelids gently, performing this final service for a boy she had known for less than a day. She would write to Anna Richter in Stuttgart, would tell her that her son had been brave, that he had not suffered long, lies that might offer some small comfort. She would not tell her about the cold and the fear, about how he had called for her at the end, about how many thousands of other mothers were receiving similar letters. She covered him with a sheet and moved on to the next bed and the next, carrying the weight of this death and all the others, adding it to the accumulation of grief that threatened to crush her completely. In the countryside, the night was quieter but no less heavy. Carl stood in his barn, unable to sleep, checking on animals that did not need checking. The cow shifted in her stall, her breath steaming in the cold air. The chickens roosted peacefully, oblivious to human troubles. There was something comforting in their simple existence, their needs uncomplicated by ideology or moral compromise. He thought about the figure he had seen at the edge of the field, the one he had not reported. The potatoes he had left had been taken. He had left more tonight, a small bundle of carrots, some dried beans, a piece of bread wrapped in cloth. It was not much, but it was something. A gesture that felt both necessary and terrifyingly inadequate. Who was he helping? A deserter? An escaped prisoner? Someone Jewish fleeing for their life? He did not know, and perhaps it was better that way. Knowing created responsibility, created risk, created the possibility of betrayal under interrogation. Ignorance was a thin protection, but it was all he had. He heard footsteps and turned to find Helga standing in the barn doorway, wrapped in a shawl, her face pale in the moonlight. "I know what you're doing," she said quietly. His heart seized. "Helga, I'm not going to stop you. But you need to know the risk. If they find out, they won't just take you, they'll take me. They'll take our son's benefits. They'll label us traitors, and everything we've worked for will be gone." He nodded, his throat tight. "I know. I can stop." I should stop. She was quiet for a long moment, her eyes distant. "My grandmother used to tell a story about a man who saved a sparrow in winter. The sparrow was just one bird among thousands freezing to death. Saving it changed nothing, really. The winter was still cold. Most birds still died. But that one sparrow lived because someone chose to act instead of turning away." Carl felt tears prick his eyes. "One sparrow doesn't matter against a winter." "No," Helga agreed. "But it matters to the sparrow." She turned and walked back toward the house, leaving him alone with his thoughts, with his fear, with his small acts of defiance that would never appear in history books, but that maintained some essential part of himself he could not afford to lose. He stayed in the barn a while longer, then walked to the edge of the field and left his bundle near the trees. Tomorrow it would be gone, or perhaps the authorities would find it and trace it back to him. He did not know which would happen. He knew only that he could not stop, could not return to complete compliance, could not let the winter take every sparrow without trying to save at least one. In the hidden attic where the resistance cell had gathered earlier, one member remained. Ernst was a printer by trade, and tonight he worked by the light of a single candle, setting type for pamphlets that would be distributed in secret, left in telephone booths and tucked into newspapers. Brief messages of truth that might reach someone, might plant seeds of doubt in the carefully tended garden of propaganda. His fingers moved with practiced precision, selecting letters one by one, arranging them into words that could cost him his life. The war is not being won. Our soldiers are dying in the thousands. The government lies to preserve power, not to protect you. Think for yourself. Question what you are told. Remember that you are human before you are German, and humanity demands more than obedience. Simple words, plainly stated, printed on cheap paper with ink that smudged easily. They would reach perhaps 100 people, perhaps 1,000 if luck was with them. Most would throw them away immediately, frightened by their possession. Some would report them to authorities. But a few, perhaps a handful, might read them and feel something shift inside. Some small crack in the edifice of certainty. Ernst knew the odds. He knew that his work was dangerous and largely futile, that the regime's propaganda machine was too powerful. too pervasive to be countered by handmade pamphlets distributed in darkness. But he also knew that silence was complicity, that doing nothing was its own kind of action, its own form of guilt. He had lost his wife 2 years ago, arrested for hiding a Jewish family in their cellar. She had been sent to Ravensbrück and had not survived. He had not known about the family she was hiding. She had protected him with her silence, had taken the entire burden herself. When he learned of it after her death, he had been devastated by his own ignorance, by the fact that she had been so brave while he had been so blind. This was his penance, his way of honoring her memory, his attempt to become worthy of the sacrifice she had made. He printed through the night, his hand steady despite the fear that never left him, despite the knowledge that every sheet of paper was evidence, every word an act of treason. When dawn approached and he could no longer work safely, he bundled the pamphlets and hid them beneath floorboards in false walls, in places he had prepared for this purpose. Tomorrow night, he and others would distribute them. And the night after that, if they were still free, they would do it again. It was not enough. It would never be enough. But it was what he could do, and so he did it, night after night, keeping alive some small flame of resistance in the overwhelming darkness. As the night reached its deepest point, that hour before dawn when the body's defenses are lowest and the mind most vulnerable, Marguerite lay in her narrow bed, unable to sleep. She thought about the list she had typed that afternoon, the names that would become absences, the lives that would be interrupted and destroyed by her efficient keystrokes. She had made her small rebellion, the transposed digits, the deliberate error. But was it enough? Did it matter? One person delayed was not one person saved. The machinery would correct her mistake, recalibrate, continue its grinding forward motion. And she would be there tomorrow and the day after, typing more lists, filing more reports, her complicity accumulating like compound interest. She thought about quitting, about refusing, about standing up and saying, "No more." But what would that accomplish beyond her own arrest and replacement? Someone else would sit at her desk, type the same lists, file the same reports. Her moral stand would change nothing except to ease her own conscience. And even that relief would be brief, ending when the cell door closed behind her. This was the trap they all lived in, the knowledge that individual resistance was both necessary and futile. That refusing to participate meant being crushed while the system continued without pause. That surviving meant compromising, and compromising meant carrying weight that grew heavier with each passing day. She wondered if there would ever be an accounting, a time when people like her would have to answer for what they had done. Would anyone believe that she had felt trapped, that she had made small rebellions even while continuing to collaborate? Or would history judge her simply by her actions, by the lists she typed and the system she served? And if such an accounting came, what would she say? That she was afraid, that she wanted to survive, that she had done small things to resist while continuing to enable the machinery of destruction? Would those excuses matter to the people whose names she had typed, whose fates she had helped to seal? She had no answers, only the weight of questions that pressed down on her chest like physical stones. She turned onto her side, curled into herself, and waited for a sleep that would not come easily. That would be filled with dreams of typewriters and lists and names that transformed into faces she could not save. In his cell in a prison across the city, a man named Otto sat awake on a hard bench, his body aching from interrogation, his mind hovering in that strange space between fear and resignation. He had been arrested 3 days ago for telling a joke about Gring's weight. A stupid joke, carelessly told, overheard by the wrong person. He had expected a warning, perhaps a fine. Instead, he had been taken to this place, this gray building where people disappeared into rooms and emerged broken or did not emerge at all. He had been questioned, beaten, questioned again. They wanted names. Who had he told the joke to? Who had laughed? Who else harbored defeatist attitudes? He had given them nothing, not because he was particularly brave, but because there was nothing to give. It had been a joke, a moment of frustration, nothing more. But the interrogators did not believe in nothing. They believed in networks, in conspiracies, in patterns that justified their existence and their methods. Tomorrow they would question him again, and he did not know how much more he could endure. Pain was one thing. The body could only hurt so much before it numbed itself, before consciousness retreated to some protected space. But the psychological torture was worse. The uncertainty, the isolation, the fear that this would never end, that he would simply cease to exist in this gray place, his absence explained away with official stamps and bureaucratic language. He thought of his family, his wife, his daughter. Had they been notified? Were they waiting for him? Or had they already been told he was an enemy of the state, that his name should not be spoken, that their best chance at survival was to forget he had ever existed? The night stretched endlessly. There was no clock, no window, no way to mark time except by the changing of guards, the delivery of meager meals, the sounds of other prisoners being moved through corridors. He drifted in and out of sleep, jerking awake whenever footsteps approached, his body tensing in anticipation of the door opening, of being dragged back to the interrogation room. But the footsteps passed. The door remained closed. And Otto sat in the darkness, a man whose life had been destroyed by a joke, whose fate had been sealed by careless words, who had learned too late that in this new Germany, there was no such thing as harmless humor, no space for momentary frustration, no forgiveness for human weakness. As the first gray light of dawn began to soften the night's darkness, the city prepared to wake once more. In 1,000 bedrooms, alarms would soon ring. In 1,000 kitchens, ersatz coffee would soon be brewed. The machinery of daily life would resume. The performances would begin again. The masks would be carefully fitted back into place, but the night had taken its toll. Families had been disappeared. Soldiers had died. Resistance fighters had worked in shadows. Children had lain awake with questions they could not ask. And in countless hearts, the weight of complicity, fear, and silent witness had grown heavier. The night was both truth and terror, the time when the regime did its darkest work, but also the time when individual humanity persisted in small, hidden ways. Acts of kindness in darkness, moments of honesty between married couples, prayers whispered by those who still believed in something beyond the state, thoughts that could not be spoken aloud, but that maintained some essential spark of independent consciousness. As the sun prepared to rise on another day in Nazi Germany, the night's lessons would be carefully packed away, hidden beneath the necessities of survival, buried beneath the routines that allowed people to continue functioning. The day would demand performance. The night had allowed glimpses of truth. And between these two realities, millions of people existed, trying to navigate impossible circumstances, trying to maintain their humanity in a system designed to destroy it, trying to survive with some part of themselves intact. The 5th chapter was ending, but its weight would carry into the morning, into all the mornings to come. The night had spoken its truths. Now the day would return with its demands and its lies, and the cycle would continue until something, war's end, regime collapse, personal breaking point, finally interrupted the terrible rhythm. But that interruption was still years away. For now, there was only the endless succession of nights and days, each one a test of how much people could endure, how much they could compromise, how much they could witness in silence before silence itself became unbearable. The darkness was lifting, morning was coming, and with it, all the terrible ordinary rituals would begin again.